I want to close the loop on these four things. We talked about sleep for a while. The first one was intake of glucose. Second thing was you don't have the efficient muscle to take in the glucose. The third is sleep disturbance. We talked about that for a while. What was the fourth thing that we were going to cover here?
Stress.
Yeah.
So cortisol is a really important hormone. Without it, you'd be dead. But too much of it can really wreak havoc. And a big part of what too much cortisol does is really drive that excess production of glucose out of the liver. And so, of these four, I certainly have never seen a case where just stress alone resulted in diabetes in a person whose nutrition intake, their intake, their exercise, and their sleep were perfect. But it really is like having just a little bit of extra kindling on a fire. It really gets things. Yeah, it is. It's a multiplier.
What are the three causes of stress?
Well, I mean, I think there are many causes of stress, right? So I think you've got kind of you could divide it into sort of internal versus external, right? So I think of this in a way that says, look, it's really more about a person's response to externalities. Right?
Response to the experience, the event,
that's right.
thing that happened.
That's right. You can have three people that are exposed to the exact same externality that have three completely different responses to it. So I think it's less productive to focus on the external piece and more productive to focus on the internal piece. So this is where I think my favorite by far, well, so now I think there are three ways we can go about coping with this, because this kind of goes, this is just the tip of the iceberg, is the stress piece. This really becomes now the sort of gateway into what is mental and emotional health all about.
Yes.
And now I think there are basically three. You can see I'm a very pillared, structured, levered guy, right?
I like
it. So now we go into basically three ways that we can approach dealing with this. One of these is through psychotherapy, which I'm a huge proponent of. Pharmacotherapy, which I'm also a proponent of, though I think it's vastly misunderstood. And then behavioral therapy, which I'm an overwhelming proponent of. In particular, a type of behavioral therapy called dialectical behavioral therapy, or DBT. And again,
DBT therapy.
Yes, dialectical behavioral therapy, not to be confused with cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, which is also popular, but I believe that DBT is more efficacious. But that said, I think different personalities respond different to different versions. For what it's worth, my personality responds so much better to DBT than CBT, so therefore I found it to be much more helpful.
So these three things will help give us the tools to cope with stress.
Yes.
Gotcha. And what I'm hearing you say is a lot of people lack tools for these three main things: cognitive, physical, and emotional resilience. We're lacking the tools to then amplify them in our favor as opposed to against us. And the more tools we can gain, then we could hopefully take the actions to live healthier and longer.
Yeah, and it has to be proactive. I mean, I think that's the piece that's inherent in what you said, is at some point you have to decide you're going to go on offense. So you can't just sit on defense and say, I'm going to take it as it comes, and what's going to happen is going to happen. And I think you have to take this view which says, I'm going to be incredibly proactive, and I might not be able to control everything. I don't represent that, there's some path where everybody's going to be able to make it to live to 100. There are just some people whose genes don't command that. And that's fine. There are people out there who have so many, genetic things working against them that they'll be lucky to make it to 80. But the point is, without making these proactive changes, they might have lived only until 70. And to your earlier point, they might have spent the last 20 of those years in an unbelievable state of misery. So when you contrast, living to 70, spending 20 years in misery versus living to 75 with maybe 2 years in misery, it just doesn't even strike me as a trade-off.
The more I'm hearing you speak, and the more I've done my own research, I'm not a medical professional, but I've interviewed a lot of incredibly smart people who study this. it's for some reason, it's all coming back to emotional and mental health. Because if we aren't able to have control or learn to navigate our emotion and the way we think, then we're going to make bad decisions, which will turn into bad results for our health and our life. Is this off, that if the root being mental and emotional health is potentially the thing that could cure and help us live longer, but if we take care of everything else but that, then we're always going to go back to these negative patterns that hurt us, or is that all?
I don't think it's off. I think they all have to be in place. I mean, I think I'll share with you one sort of illustration. So I've been working on this book for 4 years now, and it's evolved a lot because it started out mostly just being a book about the science of longevity. So, to me, a very, very technical book, but one that I was incredibly proud of, and one that I think would have been read by the 15 most respected scientists in the field
right.
who would have thought it was amazing, and nobody else would have read it. So then it basically got reworked, and it became more accessible and more personal, and it kept getting reworked until it basically got to a point where it was a pretty good overview of every single thing we've talked about today, except for this emotional and mental health piece. And that's that's basically the piece that's delaying it. But it is that realization which said there could be no greater torture than to figure out how to live longer and how to preserve cognitive and physical health, but without that emotional piece being in check. In other words, to extend a miserable life is torture.
So at the root of what we're trying to figure out here is, how do we cultivate inner peace, inner happiness, peace of mind, peace of emotions during our life? That's a big component to health span, right?
It is. And I won't represent that I fully have this figured out. I mean, in fact, that would be the hubris to declare that would be embarrassing. But I think for me, I like the word joy,
Yes. Joy is
because it kind of captivates one of the things that I have found to be central in my journey in this space, which is it captures the piece about being with others that I've so historically ignored. I'm very fortunate to have a few therapists, 3 actually. So I actually have a therapist in each of those disciplines, right? So I have somebody that I work with on the behavioral side, on the psychotherapy side, and on the pharmacology side. And the person who is my psychotherapist, so she's the one that I speak with weekly about this, the how am I feeling stuff.
Life.
Yeah. Her name is Esther Perel.
Oh, I love Esther. I've had her on many times.
She's amazing. And she said to me a couple of years ago, maybe 2 years ago, and she said, look, you've run a playbook that has only had 3 plays in it. You've executed them as well as anybody could execute those 3 plays, but you are really at the end of this. And and those 3 plays were obsession, detachment, and rage. And that's it.
Oh, wow. Those are very extreme.
Those are the only 3 tools you have. And they're the only tools you've had since you were 5 years old. And you've gone very far with them. But, it's led to incredible isolation, incredible pain, and all these other things. And it took a while to understand how that could be the case and how to begin to fix that. But and it's not something that you change overnight, of course, but what I'm so much more appreciative of now is the fundamental difference that comes from fighting back the urge to detach. So again, this is just one very, very narrow example, but there are probably some people who can appreciate this, which is in periods of fear, it's sometimes easy to pull back and to retreat. And to me, that's a joyless state, right? That's basically saying, I don't want to be connected to anyone. I don't want to be relational, to borrow a word from another amazing therapist I had, Terry Reel, who actually met through Esther. So once you sort of stop living a relational way, I mean, it sounds very cliche for someone who's so interested in science as I am, but I think once you cease to live in a relational way, I think you're on that path to a very slow death.
When you isolate yourself more and you don't cultivate strong relationships, you die faster. Is that what I'm hearing you say? Or you
Well, whether you whether you
feel
die
more pain?
faster in the death certificate or not,
Yeah.
some data would suggest you do, but I think those
You
data are
suffer more.
difficult. Yeah, you suffer more. So what does it matter? Like
Yeah.
even if you don't end up in a casket sooner, you might as well because
Right.
you're suffering
You're
and
suffering. Yeah. You're lonely. You're isolated. So what were the three
you're
plays?
miserable and you're,
Miserable.
yeah. So
What were the three plays that you added to bring more joy in your life?
well, I think it's basically looking at how to reverse each of those patterns and working very hard to do so. And that's been a lifelong, or I shouldn't say lifelong journey. It's only something I've been working on for 3 years, but it's definitely harder than anything I've ever done.
So from rage to what would be the opposite for that?
Oh, to an expanded emotional vocabulary,
Uh-huh.
right? So
Yeah.
so you could so rage for me, think of a funnel where every possible negatively valenced emotion funneled into rage. So
Anger and rage. Yeah.
anger becomes rage, fear becomes rage, um, uncertainty becomes rage, anxiety becomes rage,
Defensiveness.
becomes
Yeah.
rage, right?
Resentment. Yeah.
Rage, right? Okay, so the first step in that is mindfulness. So meditation obviously is a very important exercise that we can do to learn how to stop and identify that. And so if you look at me today versus if you look at me 3 years ago, when, I literally was on the verge of, killing somebody in a parking lot at some point, a big difference is now if something upsets me, I now have the gap between stimulus and response to examine the emotion and say, oh, that email really upset me
Mm-hmm.
because the person implied something that is threatening to my credibility or something like that, right? So it's like having the space to go through that process and then having the vocabulary now to do it. Now, literally, it means I've had to print out worksheets like I'm in grade school again
Mm.
with sheets and I go through exercises. So I have homework every single week where I go through, okay, when this happened, how did you feel? What was that emotion signaling to you? So there's, part of it is going through that type of an exercise. So I think that's been the biggest tool there. I think as far as the obsession goes, part of it that's been more of a displacement. So that's been more of I created a contract basically,
Mm.
much in the same way that a person who goes into a 12-step program does. So I do consider myself a recovering addict.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think that I have more of a socially acceptable addiction. So I think
Right.
we
Hard
look
work
at people,
and
yeah, perfectionism and hard work are socially acceptable addictions, but the reality of it is they can be quite damaging to your offspring, which is, I think, for most of us, our biggest fear is that we hurt our kids. And so after going into, I did effectively go into rehab. And after doing that, I have a contract and I have people that function as my sponsors.
mm.
And there has been some very, very deliberate changes in practices. And it sounds silly, but it had to start out with creating very structured things that you wouldn't think a parent would need to do, but mandatory 30 minutes of playtime each day.
I just think people have lost the art of joy and play. It's one of the reasons it's funny, I'm in this you know, high-end condo building here in Los Angeles, right in the middle of Century City. I'm not sure if you've been to this area, but there's a lot of corporate buildings. And so everyone's in their suits and ties. And I literally am right next to my studio about 2 blocks away. And I have a scooter that I get on, not a electric scooter. I have like a manual scooter where I push myself on a scooter. I come down the elevator with the scooter. and walk out my front building hallway, and there's literally every luxury car you can think of, every one of a kind, Lamborghini to Ferraris. It's kind of obscene, these types of cars that you see, the Rolls Royces, all of them. We're in like the heart of Beverly Hills. And I come out on a scooter and I just don't care. I'm scooting around. I don't care what people think about me. I'm going to have fun because I feel like a lot of people have lost the art of being a child, of joy, of play. And I'm trying to enjoy it myself and also cultivating others. Hey, it's okay to just be goofy and playful and have fun, right? So mandatory playtime, I think, is a powerful thing.
This is a big part of the playbook. It's just, it's grunt work actually, but you have to do it to create new habits, and it doesn't take as long as you would think. I thought it would take a lifetime to change, and yet I would say, even when I look at how much I've changed in the last 6 months, I would have never believed this much change was possible in this short period of time.
How important is health span and lifespan related to healing the past, whether that be yesterday's past event, childhood past, relationship past, all past hurt? How important is healing the past with health span?
I don't think, first, again, that's a very good question. Assuming we're not talking about things that are so suppressed that we can never understand them, but which we could debate how much that could still be impacting today. And the answer is it could still be a lot, and it probably is. I'm a huge believer in understanding previous trauma. And in fact, I've interviewed several people on the podcast about that. Lori Gottlieb, who I think you've had on the show, she's excellent. A very close friend and a remarkable psychiatrist, Paul Conti, Corey McCarthy. I've talked about this with a lot of people. Corey was a guy who was incarcerated for many years, kind of turned his life around in jail. But again, you could peg so much of his tragic life story to, getting molested at a ballpark when he was a 7-year-old boy. And so I don't think you can disentangle these things. And just as I said at the outset, we're in a world where people don't want to talk about mental and emotional health as much. I think that's changing, by the way. And I think people like Lori and Paul are a huge part of that change. I hope with that comes an understanding that we have got to figure out a better way to deal with trauma. And trauma is not all big T trauma. Right. It's not all, it's a lot of little T traumas add up. And most of us, I think, have had some sort of adaptations to things in our past that have come at a cost. And so a lot of those adaptations are positive, right? A lot of those adaptations are what got us through those things. And that's why I think many people are reluctant to face them and say, hey, this thing's bad. I mean, I certainly refuse to ever acknowledge any of my traumas as problematic, even though I never had an issue not understanding what they were, but I just thought, well, they're very productive. Like, in a very convoluted way, they told a story that I thought was very good, and they resulted in all of these traits like rage, obsessiveness, and isolationism.
Where you got results.
I got amazing results. If you can put your head down and do anything. So it's when you sort of let that armor down, when you put that guard down, and you allow yourself to sort of crack open. And Lori wrote about this in a way that I thought was beyond amazing in her book, which is why I wanted to interview her. There was a particular story about two of the people she wrote about in her book that I thought most amazingly demonstrate how a traumatic past can just, create for a devastating life, no matter the success. It feeds into all of the above. So I think that, to answer your question, does that impact the physical? Yes. Does that impact the emotional? Yes. And I'll share with you a story that I think even Paul and I discussed, which was about 6 years ago. I had a patient who had was really on the verge of being diabetic. So she wasn't, but she was close, and she was probably 20 pounds overweight and was very frustrated because she was incredibly compliant with everything I asked her to do. Right. So, I said, we're going to change your nutrition this way. She did it. We're going to change your exercise this way. I need you to sleep more this way. We did everything right, and her numbers got a bit better. She didn't really lose any weight. She wasn't really feeling much better. And I was really feeling like, If it were anybody else, I would say she's probably not doing what I'm asking, but I really knew she was. And one day we were just sort of sitting there talking, and I don't know how it came up. I knew that her father had died when she was young, like in college, but something about the way it came up this time made me think it was creating a much bigger imprint than had been dealt with. Now, she'd been on an antidepressant since college, and she's in her mid 40s. So we're talking 25 years later. But I just wondered, I said, is there an issue here? Is there sort of a psychological pain that is literally impairing her body's ability to get better? So I said, look, this is going to sound crazy, but I'd like you to go and see this other doctor. He's a psychiatrist, but he's really, really smart. And I want to explore this mind-body connection in a way that doesn't sound so hokey. Would you be up for this? And to make a long story, she said yes. And within a year, you couldn't recognize her. Yes, he'd made changes in her medication. So maybe it's possible that some of the changing her from one type of antidepressant to another could have made a difference. But I do believe that a bigger part of the difference was just that she got so much more in touch with what had happened and came to grips with it and had begun to work through that trauma, that kind of letting that go. And you've probably read The Body Keeps Score. And there are lots of people who have really talked about this idea. And I've seen now enough empirical examples of this that I'm inclined to believe this is true, and therefore it shouldn't be ignored.
What do you think are the main causes of emotional and mental health disease, I guess? What are the main causes of the lack of a strong mental and emotional well-being?
If you come at it through the lens of trauma, so let's take off the table for a second the sort of genetic causes, because there's a clear genetic relationship with mental health. So I know, for example, in my family, there is a non-trivial amount of genetic mental health problems. So I had an uncle who had schizophrenia. I basically have the following in my family. I think schizophrenia, depression, and probably maybe some bipolar. So there's clearly a genetic component. I'm inclined to think that trauma plays a great role in this. And I think trauma comes in different flavors. So the most obvious form of trauma is abuse. And abuse can be physical, sexual, spiritual. Those would be sort of, obvious forms of abuse. Another one would be neglect. So neglect is a form of trauma. And that can be a kid who grows up in a house with two parents who never lay a hand on him or her, but completely ignore him and, don't parent him at all, or, he's raised by a nanny, but really never gets the attention that a child needs from a parent. Abandonment is another form of trauma. So this is different from neglect. This is, obviously more extreme. And it's when a child is actually abandoned by one or more parents. Another form of trauma that most people don't think of is enmeshment. So this is when a child basically has to grow up too quickly and is forced into the role of sort of being an adult with one of their parents. And, that doesn't at all imply a sexual connotation or anything, but it's, the
responsibility is very early. Yeah,
that's right. And also just the emotional burden that comes with it. Right. So, an example might be a single mom who basically relies on her 10-year-old son as her
a confidant, or whatever.
As a confidant, and complains to him about her boyfriend, and and basically makes he has to grow up far too quick, and things like that. And then I think another part of trauma is basically witnessing tragic events, and that could be like in the case of my patient, losing her father suddenly, or post 9/11, many people were obviously traumatized by, things like that. So there are lots of, tragic events that can do it. Now, within each of those, Lewis, any two people can have a totally different response. So
based on
I'll
your
give you
emotional tools that you have
based on
available.
your resilience to begin with. So again, one of my favorite examples of this is, do you know who Rick Elias is? Does that name ring a bell?
I'm not sure if I do.
So amazing guy. He was on that U.S. Air flight that crashed in the Hudson River
Uh-huh.
11 years ago, January 2009. He has a beautiful TED talk. It's very short. It's like 7 minutes long that talks about it. And it's titled something to the effect of the 3 most important lessons I ever learned in life. And it's basically what he learned in the couple of minutes thinking he was dead.
Mm.
Rick is one end of the spectrum, right? He lives through this plane crash. That night, he was back on a plane to fly home to Charlotte. Like,
Crazy.
Right? Like 4 hours after he's almost dead, he's back on a plane flying. His life is taken off. They had a 10-year reunion for the survivors where they all got to meet up with, Captain Sullenberger, the guy who did this amazing landing. Yeah, Captain Sully. He mentioned to me there were people from that night whose lives have been destroyed and who've never been able to get on a plane since.
Oh, man.
So think about that for a second. The exact same experience will produce an entirely different set of responses in people. And that's why I think we have to be very humble when we think about trauma. And that's why I get a little annoyed when I hear people say, well, this person had this happen to them and look at how great their life turned out. And somehow they say that as though to minimize what has happened to somebody else.
Yeah.
And to me, that's just utter nonsense.
And judging people's experiences and making them wrong or telling them, step up or whatever is what I'm hearing you say is not the best approach, which is probably something that I would have done in the past as this football mindset of like, just tough it up and quit being a wussy and, quit crying about some scrapes here and there. But that's not the best approach.
No, it's not a great long-term approach. We have to be pretty nuanced in this, and we have to be able to really kind of treat everybody's pain like it's their own pain and nobody else's. And now,
and not comparing.
Why is
I went through all these tragic events and I'm able to deal with it, but you went through this little trauma and you're stuck on this, not doing that.
Yeah. The 2 fastest ways to not recover from trauma are to compare yourself to others and to minimize your pain. It sounds crazy, but and I, believe me, I went through, I could tell just horrible experiences of going through kind of this journey and having to fight the urge to do those things, but just the constant desire to minimize and say, it's not that bad. It's not that bad. It's not that bad. Let's stop making a big deal out of this. Or, but this person went through so much worse. And, none of that matters, like this, whatever, 100 people on that airplane all experienced the same external truth, which was the plane crashed. But there's 100 different internal truths that came out of that.
So emotional resilience is a massive key of what I'm hearing you say in some of the ways to develop more emotional resilience is to have psychotherapy, pharmacotherapy, and behavioral therapy to gain tools, awareness, acceptance, forgiveness. The tools
I would say when indicated, certainly most people probably don't need pharmacotherapy, meaning they don't need any medications to aid in these things. But there are, there is such an amazing toolkit of medications out there that do aid in the increasing this buffer, this what I think of as this bandwidth of distress tolerance, right? So again, it's the difference between, if you think about a person who can only live between the temperature of 97 and 98, boy, they're going to be in for a tough life compared to somebody who can live between 95 and 105. So similarly, a person who, anytime they fall below here, they're going to be depressed. And anytime they go above here, they're going to flip into a fit of rage. That's a miserable life compared to somebody who can live here.
What would you say are some of the things besides going to therapies as gaining tools? What would be some of the things that we could develop more emotional resistance or emotional fitness, as someone like Tony Robbins calls it, emotional fitness, to be able to, stay more calm on the range of emotions? Kind of like when you see Tom Brady, where you throw an interception or you throw a touchdown, it's a similar emotion, and not allowing yourself to get too high or too low. What are some key tools we could do to develop more emotional resistance in your mind from your personal experience?
For me, I think it's been several things. I do think mindfulness meditation, so a Buddhist style of meditation or a Vipassana style of meditation, has been very helpful because it is a tool that teaches you to examine your mind. And that's effectively what we're dealing with here. So when somebody is all over the place with respect to their emotions, what is probably happening is they're being hijacked by thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
That's generally what's happening. And that's okay because that's innate. Like that's as common as the day is long.
Is mental illness, negative emotional fitness, I guess, is that our thoughts are being hijacked over and over in a negative way, and therefore we get stuck in states of depression or
Yeah, this and again, this is so complicated, right? Because you want to separate out some of the really clear pathologic states that I think fall outside of the purview of this. But but I think for many people, it's you have a genetic predisposition to depression or dysthymia that then gets exacerbated with negative thought patterns.
Gotcha.
And so the question is, how do you break that cycle? I think step one is learning to recognize it. So just, do you see it?
Being aware of your thoughts.
Are you even aware that you're thinking? Like, I don't know if you meditate, Lewis, but for most people, when they become early in their meditative practice, it's like the first time they realize how much they're thinking, like when they're not doing anything else. Like they're walking down the street and you realize, oh my God, I'm thinking, Dan Harris, who's a good friend. Dan is one of my favorite people to talk about this stuff with, because I think he's so down to earth in being able to communicate sort of the humor of this, right? And his book, 10% Happier, which is actually the reason, it was his book, 10% Happier, that got me to start meditating. He just does such a funny job of explaining how ridiculous our minds are. Like the dumb stuff we keep saying to ourselves. And like the loops of just complete stupidity, right? So step one is recognize that. Step two, can you not judge it? Can you instead just label it unemotionally? Oh, that's a planning thought. Oh, that's a regretful thought. Oh, that's a judgment thought. Okay. So that, to me, that's really hard to do. And if I can do that 20% of the time, I'm doing well. But being able to do that 20 or 25% of the time, which is probably where I am, has had like an 80% improvement in the quality of my life, which I actually wouldn't have expected that. I would have thought you needed to get to 80% there to have 80% elsewhere. So it tells me that some of the other things I'm doing are probably moving the needle as well. And a big part there is journaling.
Really?
So yeah, another good friend of mine.
I love a doctor is telling us to journal. I love a physician is telling us to journal.
Yeah. Have you interviewed Ryan Holiday?
Yeah, a few times.
Yeah. So this, Ryan is a big proponent of journaling, and I find it to be really productive. And at times I go in a structured way, meaning like there have been periods where I've said, look, I'm going to journal through these three things every single day. So I'm going to journal something that I thought about that upset me, something that I'm really proud that I did, something blah, 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 blah. And so you sort of force yourself to come up with these three things, but that becomes a very good pattern, because it now gets you into that thinking process. And then other times, like right now, I'm not doing structured journaling, but I'm doing, really sort of deep, insightful journaling on sort of threads that are relevant, and that I sort of bring into therapy, and they become kind of the substrate for those discussions.